The room went dead silent when she arrived. Not because Sarah Chen walked in, nobody noticed the night shift nurse slipping through the employee entrance at Cedar Creek Medical at 11:27 p.m. The silence was already there, waiting in the fluorescent-lit corridors of the beachside trauma center like a held breath. She moved through it the way water moves around stone, present but unremarkable, necessary but invisible. Her badge clipped to her scrubs read RN. Her file said 3 months employed. Her hands told a different story, but nobody looked at hands anymore. The November ocean crashed against the beach 200 yards from the hospital's eastern wing. Salt air drifted through the ventilation system, mixing with antiseptic and something else, the copper and iron smell of blood that never fully washed from the trauma bays no matter how many times housekeeping scrubbed. Cedar Creek Medical served Joint Base San Antonio and the families attached to it. Soldiers. Operators. The kinds of injuries that didn't ask permission before arriving at 2 a.m. Sarah Chen had worked 3 night shifts a week for 92 days. She knew the rhythm now. The quiet hours between midnight and 4 a.m. when the day staff was gone and only the injured remained, sleeping under monitors that beeped their steady arithmetic, alive, alive, alive. She clocked in at her assigned station and began her rounds. Room for 12 held a sergeant recovering from a compound fracture, femur, tibia, fibula. She checked his 4, replaced his empty saline bag, made a note on his chart. The movements were smooth, practiced, the kind of efficiency that comes from hands that have done this thousands of times. She was careful to move slowly. Careful to seem ordinary. The first discrepancy appeared on night shift 47. A patient file for Captain James Holloway, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Admitted with a grade 3 ligament tear to his left knee. Surgical repair completed. The rehabilitation schedule listed in the chart showed 3 weeks of inpatient PT, discharge on the 16th. But the billing code for equipment told a different story. Cedar Creek had charged the Department of Defense for a full-body motion capture system, the kind used for advanced military kinematics analysis. $40,000. For a knee repair. For a patient who'd already been discharged 2 weeks earlier. Sarah photographed the discrepancy with her encrypted phone, a device that looked like a standard smartphone until you pressed the power button 3 times in sequence. Then the real interface appeared. Red text on black screen. Military-grade encryption. Built specifically for the operation she'd been placed here to run. She'd been sent to Cedar Creek Medical 9 months ago by the Defense Intelligence Agency. The mission was classified as Nightingale Protocol. The target was Dr. Marcus Pierce, Chief of Orthopedic Surgery, who had constructed what intelligence suggested was a multi-million-dollar billing scheme targeting wounded Special Forces personnel. Phantom rehabilitation services. Inflated equipment costs. Services rendered to patients who'd already been discharged. Money flowing from military medical accounts into private accounts in the Cayman Islands. Captain Sarah Chen's job was to document it. Quietly. Invisibly. The kind of work that required someone who'd learned how to be invisible long before she'd become a nurse. She continued her rounds. Room for 18 held a lieutenant from JSOC Task Force 121, recovering from a blast-related concussion. She adjusted his oxygen, checked his neurological response with the kind of precision that suggested she was looking for something more than the standard Glasgow coma scale. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done emergency medicine under fire, but her face showed nothing. The mask was perfect. 3 months of practice had made it flawless. At 2:14 a.m., she sat in her car in the employee parking lot overlooking the dark beach. The folded flag lay on her passenger seat. Tan fabric with green embroidery. SSGT Maria Reyes, KIA Helmand Province 2019. The edges were worn soft from handling, from nights when Sarah sat in this car and pressed her forehead against it, breathing in the ghost of lavender detergent that Maria had always used on her uniforms. Reyes had been the one who'd taught her to suture in a way that field surgeons recognized. Reyes had been the one holding her hand in the moments when Sarah thought the shaking would never stop. Reyes had been the one who'd bled out in her arms on a stretcher in San Juan Valley while incoming fire painted the walls. Sarah touched the flag once, then photographed the billing discrepancies from 7 more patient files. The pattern was becoming clear. 38,000 here. 42,000 there. 80,000 for a rehabilitation protocol on a soldier who'd been medically discharged 6 months prior. The money was being diverted fast and in amounts large enough to trigger audits if anyone was paying attention. But nobody was paying attention. Not yet. That was why she was here. She was reviewing the billing codes for patient for 47, another sergeant, another phantom rehabilitation package, another $40,000, when the knock came on her car window. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. The knock came again, sharper this time. Through the windshield, she could see the silhouette of a man in a white coat. Not hospital issue. Something more expensive. The kind of coat worn by someone with money and the confidence that came from never having it questioned. Dr. Marcus Pierce. She cracked the window down 4 inches. The ocean breeze carried salt and the faint sound of wind chimes from someone's beachfront patio. Behind Pierce, the hospital glowed against the dark sky like a ship on black water. Late night, Nurse Chen. Pierce's voice was smooth, the kind of voice that practiced charm the way other people practice medicine. He was 53 years old, though he paid enough money to look 47. His hairline was perfect. His teeth were veneers. His shoes cost more than Sarah's monthly salary. Couldn't sleep, Sarah said. Her voice was soft. Deferential. The kind of voice that didn't threaten anyone. Thought I'd get some air before my shift. You're not supposed to start until midnight. I know. I came early. Wanted to review some charts. Pierce leaned against her car door. He was holding a travel mug of coffee, and the steam rose between them like something living. His eyes moved across her face, searching for something he couldn't quite name. In the 9 weeks since he'd hired her, he'd developed a vague sense that something about Sarah Chen didn't fit. She never asked for more hours. Never complained about night shift. Never socialized with the other nurses during breaks. She simply worked, with a competence that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than nursing school. He didn't like employees who were hard to read. Those billing protocols we discussed in orientation, he said. The equipment allocations for rehabilitation patients. Yes, doctor. Those are proprietary. They're not reviewed by night shift staff. Sarah's hands were still on the steering wheel. She was careful to keep them visible. Careful to seem small. I was just trying to understand the system better. I want to do my job well. Your job, Pierce said, is to follow protocols, not audit them. Understand? Yes, doctor. He waited a moment longer, searching her face in the darkness. She could feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing. Then he pushed off from the car door and stepped back onto the asphalt. Get some rest before your shift. You look tired. He walked back toward the hospital, his expensive shoes clicking against the parking lot. Sarah waited until his silhouette disappeared through the employee entrance before she breathed again. The exhale came slow and controlled, the way she'd learned to breathe when incoming fire was close enough to hear the snap of rounds passing overhead. He suspected something. Not proof. Not yet. But he was watching now. By 11:43 p.m., when she clocked in for her official shift, Sarah had already uploaded the billing data to a secure server and encrypted the photographs. The information would be reviewed by DIA analysts in Fort Meade, Maryland. They would cross-reference it with Pentagon records and begin building the case that would eventually end Pierce's career. But that was someone else's job now. Her job was to keep being invisible. She was preparing the medication cart in the supply room when the trauma alert came through the intercom at 1:52 a.m. The intercom crackled first, a sound like static, then, trauma alert. Gunshot wound, male, 34 years old, incoming ETA 8 minutes. The supply room was suddenly very quiet. Sarah's hand stilled on the 4 bags she was counting. Around her, the hospital shifted into crisis mode. Footsteps accelerated. Voices sharpened. The hum of machines that had seemed background level suddenly became urgent. A gunshot wound this far from the base was unusual. Most combat-related injuries came through military channels. This was something else. She was still stocking the crash cart when the Black Hawk landed on the pad outside, the rotor wash shaking the windows hard enough that she heard the glass rattle against the frames. The wind from the rotors sounded like a voice screaming, and underneath it, she could hear the thud of combat boots on tile as the military medical team moved in. She recognized that sound. She'd moved in those formations. She'd carried that weight. Sarah straightened up, smoothed her scrubs, and moved toward the trauma bay. By the time she arrived, the patient was already being transferred from the stretcher to the operating table. The medic trailing behind the stretcher was young, maybe 26, with eyes that had seen too much too soon. He had a combat patch on his uniform. Task Force 121. The same unit as the patient recovering in room for 18. Dr. Pierce was already in the bay, hands being scrubbed, his voice sharp and commanding. He was good at this part, the crisis work that kept him on base as a consultant, the work that gave him access to the surgical logs that he was systematically pillaging. Sarah moved to the instrument table and began laying out supplies. 14-gauge angiocath needles. Chest tubes. Surgical drains. The movements were automatic, practiced, the kind of work that her hands could do in perfect darkness. Around her, the trauma team moved like a well-choreographed machine, each person knowing their role. The medic was watching her. He was standing against the far wall, out of the way, arms crossed, eyes tracking the action in that hyper-aware way that only came from time in theater. Watching her hands as she worked. Watching the precise angle of her sutures when Pierce stepped back and let her repair the subcutaneous layer. Watching the way she moved like someone who'd done this exact thing while rounds came through the walls. The procedure lasted 47 minutes. By the end, the patient was stable. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. Blood pressure holding at 118/71. Oxygen saturation 98%. The kind of outcome that felt like a small miracle in a trauma bay at 2 a.m. Pierce finished his notes and pulled off his gloves with a sharp snap. "Good work," he said to his attending physicians. He didn't look at Sarah. But the medic did. As the trauma team dispersed and the patient was transferred to ICU, the young medic approached Sarah in the supply room. She was restocking the crash cart, replacing what had been used, her movements efficient and economical. "That suturing technique," he said. His voice was low. "Careful. The subcutaneous repair. I've only seen field surgeons stitch like that." Sarah's hand stilled. One needle in her right hand. One empty spool in her left. She didn't look up. "Where did you serve?" he asked. She finished placing the needle in its slot. Then she turned toward him, and for a moment, her mask flickered. Just for a second. The kind of break that happened when you encountered someone from your old life in a place where you were supposed to have no past at all. "I'm just a nurse," she said. Her voice was soft. Steady. The mask was back. The medic studied her for another long moment. She could see the recognition in his eyes. The certainty. He knew what he'd seen. But he also understood the rules. The kind of rules that kept people alive. "Right," he said finally. "Just a nurse." He turned and walked back toward the ICU. Sarah returned to the supply room and locked the door behind him. In the small space between the shelves, she reached for her locker and opened it. Inside, next to her shift clothes and her ID badge, lay the folded flag. SSGT Maria Reyes. KIA Helm and Province 2019. She touched it once. A pressure, not a grip. A moment of contact that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then she closed the locker and returned to her work. By 4:27 a.m., the crisis had passed. The trauma bay was cleaned and restocked. The patient was sleeping under sedation in the ICU. The hospital had returned to its quiet rhythm, the hum of machines and the occasional beep of a monitor the only sounds in the darkness. Sarah was reviewing charts in the break room when she noticed Pierce standing in the hallway outside, watching her through the window. He was still in his surgical clothes, and his expression was unreadable. He'd seen the medic talking to her. He'd seen the way the medic had looked at her afterward, like he'd recognized something dangerous. He didn't know what it was. But he knew it was there. And now, Sarah understood, he would begin to move against her. It wasn't a request. It was a certainty. The hunt had shifted. What had been a quiet, patient investigation was about to become something else entirely. The next voice Pierce heard, she thought, wouldn't know what was about to happen to him. The 4-star general's recovery room occupied the corner suite of Cedar Creek Medical's 3rd floor, all panoramic windows overlooking San Antonio's endless sprawl. The morning light cut through at a sharp angle, illuminating the machines clustered around his bed like metal sentries. Dr. Marcus Pierce entered at 0847, chart in hand, his footsteps carrying the weight of someone accustomed to rooms going quiet when he appeared. Sarah Chen was adjusting the fall line when he arrived. Not rushing. Not tentative. Her movements precise as a surgeon's, each gesture economical and deliberate. The general's daughter stood by the window. His son-in-law occupied the chair near the vital signs monitor, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes, the kind of posture you don't unlearn. Pierce stopped at the foot of the bed. His eyes found Sarah's hands, watching her work for exactly 3 seconds before his voice filled the room like diesel exhaust through a garage. Nurse Chen. Not a greeting. A statement of fact before the prosecution begins. Did you or did you not administer morphine at 0600 this morning? Sarah's jaw tightened fractionally. Barely visible. A tremor in the architecture of her face that lasted half a second. Her hands didn't pause. The fall line needed saline flushed, and the general's comfort was still the only thing that mattered. The dosage is documented, doctor. Pierce snatched the chart from the metal holder at the bed's foot. He flipped pages with theatrical deliberation, his jaw working as if searching for something he'd already planted. The son-in-law's eyes narrowed. The daughter moved closer to her father, protective instinct overriding protocol. This chicken scratch. Pierce held up the page. His voice remained level, almost conversational, which made it worse. Precision was more dangerous than rage. This is exactly the kind of sloppy, dangerous work I've been documenting. Incomplete notations. Questionable judgment calls in the middle of the night. The kind of pattern that concerns every administrator in this hospital. Sarah's breathing slowed. Not from fear. From calculation. Her hands continued their work, saline bag to drip chamber, gravity doing its work. Her face showed nothing. That was the discipline he hated seeing. That composure. It meant she wasn't breaking. It meant she was still thinking. The general's daughter stepped back, her protective instinct now directed toward Sarah's competence. Is my father safe with her? Pierce sighed, the sound of a man bearing an exhausting burden. We're addressing the staffing issues, I assure you. Rigorous oversight. Sarah adjusted the fall line one final time, checked the flow rate at 125 milliliters per hour, and stepped back. Her hands came to her sides. Her voice, when she spoke, carried no edge, no defensiveness, just a simple statement of fact. Your medication times are documented on page 3, General. Pain management at 0600, then again at 1200 if needed. The General nodded, grateful for the competence of someone who wasn't performing for the audience in the room. Sarah walked out. Her stride didn't accelerate. She didn't need to prove anything by moving quickly. That was the move of someone who had nothing to defend because the defense was in the work itself. In the hallway, her hands were steady. Her heart rate elevated but controlled, the same physical response to a threat that had kept her alive in Helmand Province. In the trauma rooms of FOB Shank, adrenaline was useful. Here, it was just information. Pain is data. Threat is data. Respond accordingly. The break room the next day was a study in coordinated abandonment. For nurses occupied the center table: Jenner, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Hayes. They'd rotated through the same overnight shifts, eaten lunch together for months, complained about hospital administration in the cadence of people who'd formed a real alliance. Sarah pushed open the door, lunch container in hand, and every conversation stopped like someone had cut the power. She didn't need to read the room. She'd learned to read rooms in contexts where reading them wrong meant bodies in bags. This was simpler. This was just logistics of exclusion. Jenna hesitated, her newer higher social instincts warring with peer pressure. Rodriguez touched her arm, a small gesture, nothing said, everything communicated. They gathered their containers. They gathered their phones. They left. Only Thompson made a half-hearted attempt at justification: "We have that supply inventory. It wasn't even a believable lie. The inventory had been completed 3 days ago. But lies didn't need to be good. They just needed to be coordinated. Sarah sat at the table they'd abandoned. She opened her container. She took one bite of the pasta salad that had been sitting in the break room refrigerator since yesterday. She closed the container. She threw it in the trash. She returned to work. By Thursday, she'd stopped trying to eat with the group. By Friday, she'd stopped coming to the break room altogether. The message was clear enough without repetition. Pierce had whispered something into the right ears at the right time, something about instability, something about after-hours access to files that didn't concern her, something about erratic behavior that made people uncomfortable. The specifics didn't matter. The effect was perfect isolation. A nurse surrounded by colleagues working 12-hour shifts with no one to talk to, no one to share the weight with, the kind of pressure that broke people because pressure needed somewhere to go, and Sarah had been ordered not to let it go anywhere visible. Then came the disciplinary notice. It appeared on the main unit board on Monday morning, printed on official Cedar Creek medical letterhead, posted in a spot where every nurse, tech, and resident would pass it multiple times throughout their shift. Sarah read it standing perfectly still, her eyes moving across each word with the same methodical precision she used to cross-reference patient charts. Formal warning: Chen. Failure to follow established medication protocols regarding proper documentation standards. Insubordinate responses to physician supervision and administrative direction. Concerning pattern of after-hours access to restricted files including billing records and patient financial documentation. Pattern of behavior inconsistent with professional nursing standards. Below the notice was the signature line, Pierce's name written in the kind of meticulous cursive that lawyers would later spend hours analyzing. The date. The hospital administrator's co-signature, a man Sarah had never spoken to directly, a man Pierce had probably called in the previous week with a quiet explanation about a problematic nurse who needed formal documentation of her issues. Nurses clustered around it. Whispers moved through the cluster like electricity. Sarah stood on the periphery, reading the words that had been written to make her radioactive. Not untrue enough to be obviously false. Not specific enough to be defensible. Calibrated perfectly for the thing they were designed to do: erase someone from the room while keeping her physically present. She walked to the supply closet. The one at the end of the pediatrics wing that nobody used during day shift, the one where the old equipment was stored and the overhead light flickered in a rhythm that suggested imminent failure. She opened her locker. It was modest: a few personal items, a second pair of shoes, a charger she'd left behind after a forgotten shift. And the flag. A small American flag, folded into a perfect triangle the way military personnel folded them. Pressed into a shadow box frame, the kind given to the families of soldiers killed in action. Her hands trembled as she touched it. Not fear. Not sadness, exactly, though there was sadness in there too, buried deep where it couldn't interfere with work. The trembling was something else. It was the sound of a dam holding. It was the physical manifestation of a person who had been trained to process trauma and threat and loss in ways that civilians never had to learn, now being forced to process a completely different kind of threat, not the kind you could defend against with training and experience, but the kind that came from inside the system itself, from someone who had decided you were useful only as long as you didn't see too much. The flag had come home in the box with his personal effects. They'd given her the option to keep it or pass it on. She'd kept it because some things couldn't be passed on. Some things had to be carried forward by someone who understood their weight. Back on the unit, Sarah continued her work. The vital signs didn't change. The medications were given on schedule. The documentation was meticulous. 3 more patients admitted. 2 discharges. 1 code that she arrived at before the attending physician and helped facilitate intubation 4, staying in the background, offering the right instrument at the right moment, never drawing attention to herself. But that night, during her overnight shift, everything changed. Sarah was in the records room when she should have been on the floor, a calculated risk, but the charge nurse was occupied with a new admission and the patient census was light. She photographed billing invoices with the camera on her phone, each image a precise capture of numbers that didn't match reality. Cedar Creek had billed the Department of Defense for 32 portable hyperbaric chamber sessions for wounded Special Forces personnel over the past 6 months. The invoices were pristine. The signatures were official. The amount was $847,000. The problem was that the facility's hyperbaric chamber had been out of service since April. It was still there, in the basement, waiting for a repair contractor who'd never shown up. The sessions had never happened. The patients had never been treated. The money had simply moved. A voice behind her made her hands go absolutely still. Field technique. She turned. Corporal Jensen, the visiting combat medic from Fort Carson, stood in the doorway of the records room. He wasn't supposed to be here this late. He was supposed to have finished the last patient debridement hours ago and returned to the barracks. His eyes weren't on the invoices. They were on her hands. On the way she'd instinctively moved the phone the moment she heard him approach, the movement no civilian nurse would make. A movement honed in environments where people noticed things. The wound debridement yesterday. The ranger with the shoulder injury. The way you sutured the axillary wound. Jensen stepped into the room and quietly closed the door. I've only seen field surgeons stitch like that. Economical. Fast. Under pressure like your hands knew the bullets were still coming. Where did you serve? Sarah's hands remained completely still. Her voice, when it came, was measured and level. Nursing school emphasized trauma techniques. No. Jensen's head tilted slightly. Nursing school teaches you how to tie knots. What you do is different. What you do is how you stitch when every second counts. Where did you serve? Sarah met his eyes. For a fraction of a second, something crossed between them, a recognition that didn't need words. But words were safer than recognition. Words could be deniable. I need to get back to the unit. She slipped past him, the invoices still on her phone, the photographs secure in the encrypted folder she'd created the day she arrived at Cedar Creek Medical. Jensen didn't stop her. He just watched her leave with an expression that said he knew something had happened, even if he didn't know exactly what. The next morning, Dr. Pierce received a phone call in his office from Margaret Holloway, the hospital's external auditor. Her voice carried the kind of administrative precision that people in his position both craved and feared. Marcus, we had a flag come through our system overnight. Unusual login patterns in the billing database. After-hours access from your unit during the overnight shift. One of your nurses has been photographing financial documentation. Pierce's expression didn't change. He'd been expecting this. Not the specific nurse, perhaps, but the general shape of the threat. Someone had seen something. Someone always saw something. The question was whether they understood what they were looking at. I'm already building her termination file, he said quietly. Give me 2 weeks. He'd already begun. The disciplinary notice was just the start. He made calls that afternoon to board members who owed him referral kickbacks from his private practice, careful language about reliability concerns and professional judgment issues. He called St. Mary's School of Nursing, speaking with a quiet, concerned tone about Sarah's clinical rotations, asking gentle questions that implied instability without stating it directly. He contacted his medical review consultant, a man who specialized in justifying difficult terminations, a man whose reports had been bulletproof in 3 previous cases. The net was closing. Sarah was still photographing evidence, still cross-referencing numbers, still preparing the case. But she didn't know that the thing designed to destroy her was already in motion, and that in the next few days, everything would accelerate. The general's restlessness had been building since dawn. He'd spent 48 hours in the cardiac unit at Cedar Creek Medical, machines humming their mechanical lullaby, nurses checking his vitals every 2 hours. By 6 in the morning, the walls had begun to close in. His aide, Major Clayton Graves, stood by the window watching the Gulf turn gold with sunrise, while the general made his decision without asking permission. "I need air," he said. "Real air. Not this recycled hospital atmosphere." Clayton hesitated. The discharge orders had been explicit, bed rest for another week, but nobody told a 4-star general no. They walked out through the east corridor, past the nurses' station where the night shift was dissolving into day shift, past the security desk where nobody questioned a man in a Cedar Creek medical gown with a leather jacket thrown over his shoulders. The beach was 50 yards from the property line, separated by a grassy slope and a weathered fence that had been there so long nobody maintained it anymore. The sternal wire felt tight beneath the general's ribs. He'd had this feeling before, that metallic tension just below the breastbone, like something waiting to snap. But the salt air was hitting his face now, and that was worth ignoring protocol. Sarah Chen sat in her Nissan Sentra at the north end of the beach parking lot, her break extending into unofficial territory. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her shift didn't end until 7, but the break room had become a minefield of silence and turned shoulders, so she'd claimed the car as refuge. The folded flag lay on her passenger seat, the one she'd carried since Kandahar, 2009, in a locked drawer at work, in a plastic bag under her bed at home. She couldn't say why she'd brought it today. Some days the weight of it felt lighter than others. Today it felt like gravity. The flag was from her medic partner, the one who'd bled out in her arms while she'd held pressure on a wound the size of a fist. She reached over without really thinking about it and pressed her palm against the fabric. No tremor. No heat in her face. Just the acknowledgement of what she carried, what she always carried. The Gulf was doing that thing it did in early morning, nothing dramatic, just gold light on water that looked almost forgiving. But that wasn't the worst part. The moment she saw the general stumble came without warning or preamble. He was maybe 70 yards away, moving slow along the shoreline with his aide a few steps behind. Sarah's combat awareness had atrophied in some ways over 18 months of civilian work, but certain things never degraded. She saw him list left. Saw his hand go to his chest. Saw his body recognize something catastrophic before his mind caught up. When he dropped, it wasn't a fall, it was a collapse, the kind where every system shut down at once. His aide's scream cut through the ambient sound of waves and early morning traffic. High-pitched. Panicked. The sound of someone who didn't know what to do. Sarah moved before the scream finished echoing. The car door swung open. Her scrubs caught the wind, hospital blue, soaked already with the morning dew from the parking lot. She didn't run like a nurse runs. She ran like someone whose feet had memorized the geometry of combat, economical and fast, eating ground in a way that civilians trained on treadmills could never replicate. Her badge bounced against her ribs. 50 yards became 30 became 10, and her brain was already running through the diagnostic tree. Chest pain. Collapse. He'd been sutured yesterday, she'd seen the chart, seen the sternal wire placement. The symptoms matched like a lock and key. Dislodged wire. Tamponade. Pericardial effusion pressing on the heart. He had maybe 3 minutes before the pressure crushed his cardiac output to nothing. Call 911, she told Clayton, her voice pitched low and certain. Tell them 4-star general, chest trauma, possible cardiac tamponade. Cedar Creek Medical is 90 seconds away. They need to be ready. Clayton's face had gone the color of wet sand. Who are you? She didn't answer. She was already checking for a pulse, carotid artery, 2 fingers, counting seconds. Nothing. The general's face had taken on that waxy look that meant his blood pressure had collapsed entirely. His eyes were open but tracking nothing. A jogger and 2 people with a dog had frozen 30 yards away. She could hear them beginning to form words, to panic, to do what civilians do when they see something break. She ignored them. Her car was 80 yards back. She knew what was in the glove box because she'd put it there. The knife was a Gerber LMF2 ASEC combat blade, titanium handle, sharp enough to open a chest or trim stitches or skin fish or do any number of things that had nothing to do with nursing. It had belonged to her medic partner first. She'd carried it since 2009. 5 years in a locker. 18 months in a car glove box. Never thinking about what it meant to carry a weapon when you'd promised to serve as a healer. The sand shifted under her feet. That was real. The salt smell was real. The sound of her own breathing was real. She returned with the knife and got to work. The general's shirt came open in 2 cuts, sternum to belly, around the ribs. She didn't have time for precision. She had time for speed. The skin beneath was pale and cooling. She found her landmarks by touch and muscle memory, identified the 4th intercostal space by counting ribs with the pad of her thumb. The knife went in at an angle, through skin, through muscle, through tissue that resisted and then gave. Blood came immediately, not a flood but a steady well, which meant the bleeding had already been happening internally for longer than she'd like to think about. She widened the incision, her hands moving like they'd moved under fire with artillery rounds hitting 600 meters away and the medical tent getting hit and her teammate getting smaller and smaller even as she worked. The breastbone came next. She couldn't fracture it by hand, she didn't have the leverage all the time. But the incision was enough. The pericardium opened like she'd opened 100 other times, and the blood came out in a rush. Dark venous blood, the kind that meant the heart had been working against pressure for minutes that felt like hours. She ran her hand in, found the pericardial cavity, felt for the source. The sternal wire had shifted, had pierced right through the sac around his heart, had been draining blood into the space where his heart was trying to beat. She moved the wire slightly. Just enough. Just enough for the pressure to release. The general's body did something it hadn't done in 3 minutes. It inhaled. His heart caught rhythm, she felt it flutter under her palm, felt it seek stability, felt it find it. His eyes moved. His pupils responded. His mouth tried to form words but there was no air for words yet, just the gasp of someone coming back from a place that didn't have oxygen. A jogger was screaming. Someone had a phone out. The sound of a siren was already audible, building, getting closer. The rotor wash of a Black Hawk echoed somewhere in her peripheral hearing, but that might have been memory. That might have been Hellman pushing through the current moment. Sarah stepped back from the general's open chest and stood there in her blood-soaked scrubs, the sand turning red beneath her feet, and waited for what happened next. Pierce arrived with the paramedics. She watched him take in the scene, the general with his chest open on the beach, Sarah with blood past her wrists, the tactical knife in the sand, the bystanders frozen like a photograph. His face did something she'd never seen it do before. It went absolutely still. Not angry. Not panicked. Something colder than both. Something that looked like a calculation being performed in real time. What the hell did you do? His voice came out like gravel in a cement mixer. Sarah met his eyes. She didn't wipe the blood from her hands. She didn't look away. I saved his life. Pierce turned to the paramedics before she'd finished speaking. Document all of this. Every detail. She just performed an unauthorized surgical procedure outside her scope of practice. This is a violation of every protocol we have. Level 1 Trauma Bay, get him to OR, someone call the chief of medicine. His voice had taken on that smooth quality it had when he was working a room, when he was a doctor again and not just a man who'd gotten caught. We'll need a full external medical review. Potentially the state medical board. The paramedics moved in around the general, already making decisions about airway and pressure dressings. They were good, efficient, practiced, the kind of medics who'd seen 1,000 chest traumas. They didn't ask Sarah any questions. They just moved her out of the way, began their protocols, stabilized what she'd stabilized. One of them, a woman with grey threaded through her ponytail, met Sarah's eyes for just a second. Something in that look said she understood what had just happened, even if she couldn't say it. They loaded him onto the stretcher. The siren resumed its wail. The Black Hawk sound was definitely real now, not memory, not phantom noise, but actual rotor blades cutting the morning air, military helicopter inbound from somewhere. Pierce was on his radio, his voice modulated and professional, and Sarah understood in that moment that she'd just given him exactly what he needed. Not the proof of her mistake. The proof of her liability. Not the evidence of her instability. The evidence that she was dangerous, unpredictable, willing to act outside the system, willing to take a knife to a man's chest on a public beach while civilians watched. The sun finished its rise over the Gulf. The water kept moving. The sand kept shifting. Sarah stood alone on the beach with the folded flag still sitting on her car seat, and she waited for the day to come for her. The sand was still wet when Pierce arrived. His shoes clicked against the concrete apron of the parking lot, that precise businessman's gait, the walk of someone accustomed to appearing at scenes after decisions had already been made. The paramedics were loading the general into the ambulance, oxygen flowing, cardiac monitor showing the restored rhythm that Sarah had fought for on that beach. She stood to the side, drenched, blood-dried brown on her forearms, the tactical knife already bagged as evidence by someone who didn't yet understand what evidence meant. Pierce took in the scene with the eyes of a liability accountant. Not a doctor. Not a man who saw a life saved. He saw exposure. He saw lawsuits. He saw a nurse with a weapon performing a thoracotomy on public beach property while civilians recorded on their phones. His jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with concern. Captain Chen. He used her rank like it was a diagnosis he'd just made. We need to talk about what happened here. Sarah turned. Her voice came out steady, almost detached, the voice of someone who'd already calculated the distance between truth and survival. The general arrested in cardiac tamponade. Sternal wire dislodged. He needed immediate decompression or he codes. There wasn't time for protocol. There's always time for protocol, Pierce said. His tone was smooth as surgical tape. That's what protocol is for. By noon, the incident report was filed. Sarah read it in her locker during her break, the papers trembling in her hands, but the trembling wasn't fear. It was the restraint required not to burn the hospital down. Pierce had written it with the precision of a man who'd eliminated problems before. Unauthorized medical procedure exceeding scope of practice. Reckless vigilante behavior. Gross violation of hospital policy and state nursing regulations. Patient safety compromised by unilateral decision-making. Each phrase was a brick in a wall. The words stung like they were meant to. But what froze her breath was the final line, recommend immediate termination and review of credential authenticity. He knew. Not everything. But he knew she wasn't who she appeared to be. Pierce spent the next 6 hours working his network like a conductor with a baton he'd been holding for years. The board members, 3 of them, had built their practices on his referrals. That meant they'd also built them on his silence about billing arrangements that would collapse under real scrutiny. When he called them into an emergency meeting Monday morning, they didn't ask questions. They already knew the price of asking questions. A nurse performing open-heart surgery on a public beach with a knife. Pierce laid out the liability like it was a disease spreading. The general is stable now. But what if he wasn't? What if a bystander had been injured? What if she'd severed a vessel and he'd bled out? This facility would face 6-figure settlements. Maybe 7 figures. Board member Hayes nodded immediately. Board member Conrad was already pulling up his phone to check his legal liability coverage. Board member Sterling leaned back in his chair and said the words Pierce was waiting for. "What do you recommend?" "Immediate termination," Pierce said. "And I've already contacted an external medical review team to conduct a full investigation into her practices and decision-making patterns. This needs to be documented carefully, thoroughly, legally airtight." By Tuesday afternoon, Pierce was on the phone with Sarah's nursing school dean. His voice carried the weight of institutional concern, of a fellow professional protecting the standards of their field. "I'm conducting a routine review of a former student," he said. "Sarah Chen, class of 2021. During her employment here, we've documented concerning patterns, accessing patient files during off hours when she wasn't assigned to those patients, displaying emotional detachment during team interactions, and most recently, an incident today where she made an autonomous medical decision that violated multiple safety protocols." The dean's voice came back cautious. "Sarah was exemplary during her clinical rotations. Top of her cohort." "That's interesting," Pierce said. His tone suggested it wasn't interesting at all. It suggested something darker. Because the pattern we're seeing here is concerning. The isolation, the intensity of focus on specific cases, the apparent hero-complex disorder that manifested in today's incident. Did you observe similar red flags during her education? There was a pause. Sarah knew this pause. She'd heard it before, the moment someone's certainty buckled under the weight of a suggestion. The dean's next words came slower. She was very focused. Somewhat withdrawn. "We never knew much about her background, actually. Military family, I think. That isolation pattern is consistent with what we're documenting," Pierce said, and Sarah could almost hear him writing it down, turning uncertainty into official record. "Thank you for confirming that. This helps substantiate our findings." The external review team arrived Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. sharp. Two medical consultants Pierce had used before to justify removing nurses who'd asked too many questions about billing patterns. They moved through Cedar Creek Medical like auditors hunting for mold, interviewing paramedics about the beach scene, interviewing nursing staff about Sarah's behavior, examining her personnel file with the intensity of federal investigators. One of them, the older one, pale eyes and a clipboard, spent 45 minutes pulling up Sarah's login records on the hospital computer system. The after-hours access to the billing database where she'd been documenting the fraud. The cross-referenced patient charts she'd been correlating with equipment costs. The electronic fingerprints of someone investigating something. He showed the patterns to his colleague. Neither of them understood what they were looking at. They just saw someone accessing systems outside normal protocol. Someone operating on her own agenda. Someone suspicious. Preliminary findings suggest behavioral patterns consistent with individuals operating outside normal institutional boundaries, their report stated by Thursday evening. Recommend further investigation into possible unauthorized access to restricted data systems. Friday afternoon, Pierce called her to his office. HR was already there, Linda from Human Resources, who'd been kind to Sarah once in the break room and now couldn't look at her at all. The termination letter sat on Pierce's desk like a sealed verdict. "Your employment with Cedar Creek Medical is terminated effective immediately," Pierce said. His voice carried the weight of finality. "Your unauthorized medical procedure this past Sunday, combined with concerning behavioral patterns we've documented through our internal and external reviews, represents an unacceptable liability to this institution." Sarah's hands gripped the armrests of the chair. Her nails dug into the upholstery. Her voice came out like it was traveling from very far away. "The General is alive. The General is alive despite what you did," Pierce said. His smile was thin as a scalpel. "Not because of it. Your badge, please." She unpinned it and handed it to him. The badge that had been her cover. Her shield. Her identity. He turned it over in his fingers like he was examining a forgery. Maybe he suspected that's what it was. Maybe he just wanted her to watch him hold the last piece of her official life and let it drop into his drawer. The locker was smaller than it should have been. Everything in her life at Cedar Creek Medical fit into a cardboard box the size of a case file. The cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from nurses who'd once been kind. A dying succulent with brown leaves, forgotten on the locker shelf through too many double shifts. The photograph of Maria Reyes in desert fatigues, smiling that same half-smile she always wore, the one that meant she was about to do something dangerous and didn't want anyone to stop her. And underneath, wrapped in a plastic hospital bag, the folded flag from her teammate's coffin. Sarah walked out of Cedar Creek Medical for the last time at 5:36 p.m. on a Friday. The rain had picked up, coming down in sheets that hammered the pavement and drummed against the metal roof of the ambulance bay. She didn't run. Didn't hurry. Just carried the box in both arms, letting the rain soak through her scrubs, past nurses who suddenly became very interested in their clipboards, past Dr. Pierce watching from his office window on the 3rd floor. The bus stop was 4 blocks away, on the coastal highway where the traffic hissed past like serpents. She sat on the metal bench in her wet scrubs, the box on her lap, staring at nothing. A car passed. Then another. The rain kept falling. Inside her pocket, her phone stayed dark. No calls. No offers. No one reaching out to the nurse who'd performed an unauthorized thoracotomy on a beach and gotten fired for it. Inside Cedar Creek Medical, Pierce made a phone call. His voice was satisfied, the tone of a man who'd eliminated a problem before it could grow into an investigation. "The problem has been eliminated," he said. "She's gone. We're clear." The line went dead. And Sarah sat at the bus stop, rain soaking the cardboard box, the folded flag inside growing heavier with each drop, and waited for Monday to come and take what was left. Monday morning arrived like a verdict. Marcus had watched his mother come home defeated for 3 weeks, watched her stare at nothing while rain hammered the kitchen window, watched her touch the folded flag from her partner with the tenderness of someone holding a ghost. He was 17. He understood loss the way teenagers understand it, completely and without mercy. But what he didn't understand was why she'd let someone like Pierce steal her without a fight. He found it in her bedroom closet, tucked behind winter coats she never wore anymore. A shadow box. His hands trembled as he lifted it from the shelf, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. The silver star caught the light first, its silver ribbon catching fire. Then the bronze star with the Vela device, heavier than it looked. Combat Medical Badge. His mother's name engraved on the back of each one. Captain Sarah Chen. The citation card inside read like poetry written in military precision, for exceptional valor while assigned to Special Operations Task Force in Helmand Province. Captain Chen repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to perform emergency surgical procedures. 18 wounded operators. 18. And his mother had never mentioned a single one. The hospital board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Pierce had called it to present his final evidence against her, the fabricated incident reports, the manufactured testimony, the carefully orchestrated destruction. Marcus knew because he'd listened to his mother on the phone with her DIA contact, voice flat, explaining that she couldn't defend herself without exposure. The mission came first. Always. But Marcus wasn't bound by any mission except the one he'd created himself, not letting his mother disappear. He walked into that boardroom at 8:16 a.m. carrying the shadow box like it was a weapon, because it was. 14 people sat around a mahogany table. Dr. Pierce was presenting slides, Sarah's patient files, her medication administration times, a carefully edited timeline of the beach incident designed to show recklessness rather than heroism. 3 board members nodded along, their faces already composed in the expression of people who'd made their decision. "Excuse me," Marcus said. Nobody heard him. He said it again, louder, "Excuse me." Heads turned. Pierce's expression shifted from annoyance to something harder. "Young man, this is a closed meeting. You need to leave." "My mother," Marcus said, and his voice didn't shake because he'd practiced this in the mirror for 2 hours, "needs to see these." He opened the shadow box. The room's air pressure changed. The silver star seemed to catch every light source simultaneously. The bronze medal gleamed like it was still fresh from the foundry. Marcus held the open box high enough that everyone could read the inscription. "You can't let him lie about who she is," Marcus said, his voice steadier now, carrying the weight of everything his mother had been and everything this room was trying to erase. "You can't let him do this." Sarah stood in the doorway, rain-soaked scrubs still clinging to her skin from the overnight shift she'd worked, her hair pulled back in a style that made her face look carved from stone. The cardboard box from her termination sat on the hospital corridor floor behind her where she'd set it down. She'd come to clean out her locker one final time before the formal termination took effect. The general looked at her. Recognition flashed across his face like a switch flipping. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of command. "Nightingale 6. The room fractured into chaos. One board member gasped. Pierce stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward with a sound like fingernails on glass. "This is irrelevant," he said, his voice climbing an octave. "Her personal military service has nothing to do with her civilian misconduct." But the general had already raised his hand, a gesture so economical it cut through the noise like a blade. Bronze Star salute, fist to chest, held steady toward the medals in Marcus's hands. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. A Marine Corps liaison stepped forward, a colonel with silver at his temples and the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years wearing rank like a second skin. He pulled a leather folder from his briefcase. "Captain Chen citation," he began, and his voice had the cadence of someone reading words that had been carved into official record. "For exceptional valor while assigned to Special Operations Task Force in Helmand Province, repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to perform emergency surgical procedures in austere combat conditions, demonstrating the highest standard of military medical excellence and personal sacrifice under extreme duress." He looked up from the paper. 18 wounded operators. 18 lives saved. The highest save rate of any forward combat medic in theater. Pierce tried to interrupt. "This is completely irrelevant to her conduct at this facility." "Step back," the general said. "Not a request. A command." Pierce's lawyer, who'd arrived moments earlier, placed a hand on his client's arm. Pierce sat down. The door opened. A woman in a charcoal suit stepped inside, her ID badge clipped to her belt reading Department of Defense, Office of Inspector General. Pentagon investigator. Behind her came 2 federal agents in windbreakers that said Treasury Department in white letters. "Dr. Marcus Pierce," the woman said. "It wasn't a question. We need to discuss the $2.3 million in fraudulent billing your office has processed over the past 18 months. The color drained from Pierce's face like someone had pulled a plug. The investigator pulled out a tablet and turned it so the board members could see. Equipment billed to the Department of Defense that was never delivered to wounded soldiers. Rehabilitation services charged for patients who never received them. 18 months of systematic theft from wounded Special Forces personnel while they were in recovery. She turned to look at Sarah. "We became suspicious when we noticed that Captain Chen's patients had significantly better outcomes despite receiving fewer billable services. She was actually treating them. The discrepancy led us to examine your broader billing patterns." Sarah's voice came quietly from the doorway, each word precisely measured, "The investigation I was placed here to conduct." The room crystallized. 18 years of service, 3 tours in Helmand, field surgery under fire, and every board member in that room suddenly understanding that they'd been sitting at a table with a legend while trying to destroy her credibility. Colonel Reeves from the Pentagon pulled up patient files on the projection screen. "Sergeant Rodriguez, bilateral amputee, your facility billed for 60 sessions of specialized prosthetic training he never received. Corporal Martinez, traumatic brain injury, billed for hyperbaric chamber treatments using equipment that was never delivered." He turned to Pierce. "Equipment that was funded by Department of Defense resources intended for wounded warriors." The general's voice cut through the room like a rifle shot. "You stole from my soldiers while they were wounded." 2 board members stood simultaneously. Their faces were ashen. One of them was trembling, actually trembling, as he gathered his papers. The second followed, not making eye contact with anyone as they left. The door closed behind them with a sound like finality. Pierce grabbed his briefcase. "I have patients to attend to." The federal investigator moved, her body language shifting from conversational to something harder, more absolute. "Dr. Pierce, you'll remain available for questioning. Federal agents are currently securing your office and financial records." 3 minutes of silence followed. A stretcher wheel squeaked past the boardroom door. A monitor beeped somewhere in the hospital's distant interior. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something metallic, the metallic scent of careers ending, of institutional consequences finally arriving. When the federal investigator spoke again, she was reading from her tablet. The external review team Pierce had summoned to destroy Sarah's credibility had instead discovered that his scheme was systematic, documented, traceable through every fraudulent billing code and every phantom service entry. The audit was devastating. Complete. Undeniable. The team's preliminary findings had been exactly what Pierce wanted, ammunition for termination. The full findings were a prosecutorial roadmap. "We recommend federal charges for healthcare fraud, conspiracy to defraud the government, and theft of federal funds," the investigator said. "Your plea agreement options will be explained by your counsel." Sarah stood in the center of the boardroom, rain still dripping from her scrubs, her son standing beside her with the shadow box held like a torch. The general watched her with an expression that moved through recognition into something deeper, understanding the full weight of what she'd sacrificed, what she'd carried in silence, what she'd endured to complete her mission. "Nightingale 6, he said again, and this time his voice carried the register of respect. "Thank you for your service. Then and now." Sarah's composure held. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "My job is to heal, sir. Whether in uniform or in scrubs." Marcus watched his mother's face and understood that the woman standing here was not the woman who'd stared at the folded flag at 3 in the morning. This woman wore her true name like armor. We appreciate every one of you watching. Please hit like if you're enjoying this, subscribe if you want more stories like it, and leave a comment telling us where you're tuning in from.